Trust can shatter with 3 simple words. For me, it was standing at my mother's funeral when my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, grabbed my wrist as I reached for a glass of water and whispered, "Don't drink that." 10 minutes later, I watched my stepfather collapse in convulsions, foam pouring from his mouth, while the glass I'd almost consumed sat untouched on the table. That warning didn't just save my life. It revealed a family conspiracy that had been 30 years in the making. The funeral reception is in full swing at my childhood home when chaos erupts. My stepfather Richard is writhing on the living room floor, his expensive black suit twisted around his body as he gasps for air. His face is turning blue, and white foam is bubbling from his lips like some horrible science experiment gone wrong. My Aunt Catherine is screaming for someone to call 911, her perfectly applied makeup now streaking down her cheeks in black rivers. Cousin Derek is fumbling with his phone, dropping it twice before managing to dial emergency services. But I'm standing frozen in the corner, staring at the glass of water on the side table, the same glass Mrs. Henderson warned me not to drink. The same glass that Richard had handed to me with such insistence just minutes before. "You look dehydrated, sweetheart," he'd said. "Your mother would want you to take care of yourself." Now he's dying, and I'm holding the realization that someone in this room just tried to murder me at my own mother's funeral. The paramedics arrive within minutes, but it's too late. Richard Morrison, my stepfather of 28 years, is pronounced dead at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by family members who are either genuinely shocked or putting on the performance of their lives. As they wheel his body away, I catch Mrs. Henderson's eye across the room. She gives me the slightest nod, and I know this is just the beginning. Before I tell you how a simple funeral reception became the scene of attempted murder and how my neighbor's warning uncovered decades of family secrets, drop a comment below about the strangest warning someone ever gave you. Did you listen? Because sometimes the most random advice saves your life. Now let me walk you through how this nightmare unfolded. Let me introduce you to the players in this deadly family drama, because everyone had a motive and everyone had secrets. Richard Morrison was 67, my stepfather since I was 8 years old, charming and generous on the surface, but his fatal flaw was an obsession with control and legacy. He spent decades building relationships not out of love, but out of strategic positioning for this exact moment. His need to control everything, including who inherited my mother's fortune, made him both predator and victim. Catherine Morrison is Richard's sister, 52, a real estate agent who's been living beyond her means for years, but her fatal flaw is believing that family money should solve all her problems. Desperation for financial rescue made her willing to participate in murder, but her greed made her sloppy and ultimately traceable. Derek Morrison is Catherine's son, 29, unemployed and addicted to gambling, but his weakness is that he follows his mother's lead without thinking through consequences. His addiction made him desperate enough to kill, but his stupidity made him the perfect person to frame. Mrs. Henderson is my 3-year-old neighbor, sharp as a knife despite her age, but her fatal flaw is that she sees everything and remembers everything, which makes her dangerous to people with secrets. Her decades of watching our family made her the one person who could piece together what was really happening. Dr. Sarah Chen is my mother's longtime physician, 45, ethical and thorough, but her weakness is that she trusts people to tell her the truth about symptoms and family history. Her genuine care for my mother made her an unwitting accomplice to a 30-year deception. And me? I'm Jessica Morrison, 36, a forensic accountant who specializes in uncovering financial fraud, which is exactly the skill set that made me dangerous to my family's conspiracy. My fatal flaw was believing that the people who raised me actually loved me instead of just positioning themselves to inherit from me. This story gets darker and more twisted with every revelation, and I want to know what you think. Have you ever suspected someone in your family was hiding something dangerous? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments because family secrets have a way of destroying everything, and sometimes the only way to survive is to expose the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The story begins 3 days earlier with my mother's death. Margaret Morrison, 58, had been battling what everyone believed was early-onset Alzheimer's disease for the past 18 months. She'd been declining rapidly, forgetting names, getting lost in familiar places, becoming confused and agitated. Dr. Chen had been treating her with various medications, but nothing seemed to slow the progression. I'd flown in from Seattle, where I work as a forensic accountant for a firm that specializes in uncovering financial fraud and embezzlement. My mother and I had grown apart over the years, partly because of distance, and partly because I'd never fully accepted Richard as a replacement for my father, who died when I was 7. But seeing her in those final months, confused and frightened, not recognizing me half the time, broke something inside me. The funeral was everything Richard said my mother would have wanted. Expensive flowers, catered reception, family and friends sharing memories of a woman who'd been vibrant and intelligent before the disease took her mind. Richard played the grieving widower perfectly, accepting condolences with dignity, sharing stories about their 28 years together, making sure everyone knew how much he'd loved and cared for her. But there were small things that bothered me, the way Catherine kept checking her watch during the service, the way Derek seemed more interested in inventory the house's contents than mourning his step-grandmother, the way Richard kept insisting I eat something, drink something, rest because the stress was clearly affecting me. That's when Mrs. Henderson approached me during the reception. She'd been our next-door neighbor since before I was born, and she'd watched me grow up through her kitchen window. "Jessica, dear," she said quietly, pulling me aside. "I need to talk to you privately, but not here. Can you come by my house tonight after everyone leaves?" I agreed, though I wasn't sure why. Mrs. Henderson had always been kind but distant, the type of neighbor who waves from her garden but doesn't get involved in family business. But something in her voice, urgent and worried, made me pay attention. The reception continued normally until Richard handed me that glass of water. "You've been talking to everyone, sweetheart. You must be parched." There was something insistent about the way he offered it, something that felt less like care and more like pressure. When Mrs. Henderson appeared beside me and whispered, "Don't drink that," I set the glass down without thinking. 5 minutes later, Richard picked up that same glass and drank from it himself. Maybe he was thirsty. Maybe he was cleaning up. Maybe he forgot which glass was which. 10 minutes after that, he was dead on the floor, and I was realizing that the glass had been meant for me. That evening, I walked across the yard to Mrs. Henderson's house, a journey I'd made countless times as a child, but felt strange and ominous now. Her living room was exactly as I remembered: floral wallpaper, doilies on every surface, the smell of Earl Grey tea and old books. But the conversation we had there changed everything I thought I knew about my family. "Your mother wasn't sick," Mrs. Henderson said without preamble, pouring tea with hands that barely trembled despite her age. "Not in the way everyone thought." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" "She had Alzheimer's. Dr. Chen diagnosed her. We all saw the symptoms." Mrs. Henderson settled into her chair and looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "I've been watching your family for 40 years, Jessica. I watched your father die in that car accident when you were 7. I watched Richard appear 6 months later, charming and helpful, offering to help your mother manage her grief and her affairs. I watched him marry her a year after that." She paused to sip her tea. "And I watched him slowly, systematically, poison your mother for the past 2 years. The words hung in the air like smoke. Poison. The same thing that had just killed Richard, the same thing I'd almost consumed." "Mrs. Henderson," I said carefully, "that's a very serious accusation." "I know it is. That's why I kept detailed records." She stood and walked to an antique secretary desk, pulling out a composition notebook that looked like something from elementary school. "Every day for the past 2 years I wrote down what I observed. Richard's trips to the garden center, always buying rat poison or weed killer. Your mother's symptoms, which seemed to get worse after meals that Richard prepared. The way her confusion followed patterns that didn't match actual Alzheimer's progression. She handed me the notebook, page after page of neat handwriting, dates and times and observations. March 15th, Richard returned from hardware store with bag from pest control section. Margaret seemed fine at breakfast, confused and disoriented by dinner. April 2nd, Margaret working in garden seemed normal, chatting over fence. Richard called her for lunch. 2 hours later, she was wandering the street in her nightgown. "Why didn't you call the police?" I asked. "With what evidence? An old woman's suspicions? They would have thought I was losing my mind." She sat back down. "But today, when I saw Richard hand you that glass with such determination, when I saw the way he watched to make sure you would drink it, I knew. And I couldn't let him kill you too. The next morning, I called in sick to work and started digging into my family's financial records with the same methodical approach I used to uncover corporate fraud. What I found was a carefully constructed financial conspiracy that had been in motion since the day Richard married my mother. My father had been wealthy. Morrison Construction had been a successful business, and he'd left everything to my mother with the understanding that it would eventually pass to me. When Richard married my mother, he legally adopted me, which gave him certain rights as my stepfather, but the bulk of the estate was still destined for me as the biological child. Over the years, Richard had been systematically moving money out of my mother's accounts and into investments and properties that he controlled. Nothing illegal on the surface. Married couples share finances all the time, but the pattern was clear. He was positioning himself to inherit everything while making it look like natural financial planning. The real revelation came when I accessed my mother's recent medical records. Dr. Chen had been treating her for Alzheimer's, but she'd also been running additional tests because some of my mother's symptoms didn't match typical disease progression. Blood tests showing elevated levels of various toxins, brain scans that showed damage consistent with poisoning rather than natural disease. Dr. Chen had been concerned enough to order more comprehensive testing, but my mother had died before the results came back. Results that were now sitting in her medical file, clearly showing chronic arsenic poisoning over the course of approximately 18 months. Richard hadn't just been stealing my mother's money. He'd been slowly killing her while making it look like a devastating disease. And based on Mrs. Henderson's observations and the timing of my mother's symptoms, Catherine and Derek had been involved from the beginning. Armed with Mrs. Henderson's documentation and the medical evidence, I went to the police. Detective Maria Rodriguez was initially skeptical. Grieving family members often see conspiracies where none exist, but the combination of physical evidence and witness testimony was compelling enough to warrant investigation. The autopsy on Richard revealed massive organ failure consistent with arsenic poisoning, the same poison that had been slowly killing my mother. But here's where the story gets really twisted. Richard hadn't died because he accidentally drank poison meant for me. He died because Catherine and Derek had decided he was a liability. Phone records revealed weeks of planning between Catherine and Derek, text messages about cleaning up loose ends and making sure there are no witnesses. Financial documents showing that Catherine had been stealing from Richard, even as he was stealing from my mother, creating a chain of theft and betrayal that extended through the entire family. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Richard would poison me at the funeral reception, making my death look like a delayed reaction to the stress of losing my mother. As my stepfather and legal guardian since childhood, he would inherit everything. Then, Catherine and Derek would slowly poison Richard, making his death look like grief-induced illness, and Catherine, as Richard's sister, would inherit from him. 3 generations of inheritance, stolen through 3 carefully planned murders. But the plan fell apart because Mrs. Henderson had been watching, because I'd listened to her warning, and because Richard had ended up drinking his own poison when the intended victim refused it. The trial was a media sensation. The prosecution painted a picture of a family so consumed by greed that they were willing to commit multiple murders for money. Catherine and Derek's defense attorneys tried to pin everything on Richard, claiming he'd manipulated them into participating in a scheme they didn't fully understand. But the evidence was overwhelming. Phone records, financial documents, witness testimony from Mrs. Henderson, medical evidence of long-term poisoning, and most damaging of all, Derek's confession when he realized how much trouble he was in. Derek broke under questioning and admitted everything. How Richard had recruited Catherine years earlier with promises of shared inheritance. How Catherine had recruited Derek when his gambling debts became unmanageable. How they'd researched untraceable poisons and practiced the timing of doses to make the deaths look natural. The most chilling revelation was that this hadn't been Richard's first rodeo. Further investigation revealed that his first wife, the one who died before he met my mother, had also died under suspicious circumstances. Symptoms consistent with poisoning, financial irregularities before her death, and a very convenient inheritance that had funded Richard's comfortable lifestyle until he met my mother. Richard hadn't just been a greedy stepfather. He'd been a serial killer who specialized in marrying wealthy women and slowly murdering them for their money. Catherine was sentenced to life without parole for conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to multiple homicides. Derek received 25 years for his cooperation with prosecutors. Richard, of course, was beyond the reach of earthly justice, but his reputation and legacy were destroyed completely. The hardest part of this entire experience wasn't surviving the murder attempt or dealing with the legal proceedings. It was accepting that the people I'd called family for most of my life had never actually loved me. I was never a daughter or stepdaughter or niece to them. I was always just an obstacle to money they felt entitled to. But here's what I learned. Real family isn't about blood or legal relationships. It's about people who protect you, even when they don't have to. Mrs. Henderson saved my life not because she was related to me, but because she cared enough to pay attention and speak up when she saw danger. 6 months after the trial ended, I moved back into my childhood home. It felt strange at first, living in the place where so much deception and planning had taken place, but it was also healing. I was reclaiming space that belonged to me, honoring my mother's memory in a place where she'd been happy before Richard destroyed her life. I converted Richard's office into a reading room with a view of Mrs. Henderson's house. Every morning, I wave to her through the window as she tends her garden, the same garden where she spent years watching and documenting the slow murder of my mother. Her vigilance saved my life, but it also gave my mother's death meaning by ensuring her killers faced justice. The inheritance that so many people were willing to kill for is now funding a foundation that helps elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse and family exploitation. Every dollar that Richard, Catherine, and Derek tried to steal is now helping other families avoid the kind of predatory relationships that destroyed mine. If you're reading this and something feels wrong in your family, trust your instincts. If someone is pushing you to make financial decisions that don't feel right, question their motives. If an elderly neighbor or family member seems confused or sick in ways that don't make sense, pay attention. Sometimes the most devastating crimes happen in plain sight because we don't want to believe people we love could hurt us. And if someone like Mrs. Henderson ever gives you a warning that seems random or strange, listen to them. The people on the outside looking in sometimes see things that we miss because we're too close to the situation or too invested in believing that our families are safe and loving. This story of family betrayal and neighbor heroism shows how quickly trust can turn deadly. If you believe in protecting the vulnerable and holding killers accountable, smash that like button right now. My favorite part was Mrs. Henderson's quiet heroism, 30 years of observation that saved my life and brought justice for my mother. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below because sometimes the smallest acts of courage make the biggest difference. Mrs. Henderson is 73 years old and still keeps detailed notes about everything she observes in the neighborhood. She says it's just habit now, but I think it's something more important than that. She's standing guard, making sure that what happened to my family never happens to anyone else on her watch. Richard thought my trust would make me an easy target. He thought my grief would make me vulnerable. He thought my youth would make me naive. But he never counted on a neighbor who cared enough to watch, remember, and speak up when it mattered most. That glass of water was supposed to be my death sentence. Instead, it became his. And every day I'm alive to tell this story is a day that proves love is stronger than greed, courage is stronger than conspiracy, and sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary acts of heroism. Don't miss more incredible stories of survival and justice. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Because in a world full of predators, we all need neighbors like Mrs. Henderson watching our backs.